Well, good morning, everyone. I want to welcome each and every one of you back to Mosaic. I'm really glad that you're here today because today we are continuing a series that we just started last week. It's called Lessons from a Man Who Ran. Now, if you were here last week, then you already know this is a series about Jonah, but in a lot of ways, it's also a series about you and me. As much as we hate to admit it, we all have a little bit of Jonah in us somewhere. And what I mean by that is that there's something inside all of us that has this tendency to kind of rebel against God. That there's a little bit of something inside all of us that has this tendency to disobey God. That there's something inside of us that makes us all want to do what we want to do rather than doing what God would want us to do. In fact, a lot of times we may wake up and not even consider what God might want us to do with our lives. And when I say all, I really do mean all, okay? This is not a new problem, okay? This is an age-old problem that the Bible has been talking about for a very long time. In fact, about 2,500 years ago, there was a man named Isaiah who wrote an Old Testament book. And this is what he said about this age-old problem, again, 2,500 years ago. Isaiah 53, verse 6, he said, "We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way." That means that at some point in your life, you either have or you will try to run from God. We all do it. This is something that is universally true of humanity. For some of you, you'll run just a little ways because you're a rule follower. And then there are others of you who will run a really long ways because you are a rebel. But either way, it will not work out well for you. I once heard an interview with primetime Deion Sanders. He was talking about a time in his life when he was running from God. I love how he explained his experience. He said this, he said, "I was one of the fastest human beings on the face of the planet, but I could not outrun God." Now, if you don't know anything about Deion Sanders, or maybe you just think of him as a football coach for Colorado, you need to know that he had a career way before that. Back in the 90s, he was playing both professional football and professional baseball at the highest level. He was playing in the NFL and he was playing for the MLB. In 1992, he was playing for the Atlanta Braves. They made it all the way to the World Series. Then in 1995 and again in 1996, he played with the Dallas Cowboys and they won back-to-back Super Bowls in those two seasons. In the first service here in Ocean Springs, had a lady sitting right here who must have been a Cowboys fan. She started like cheering for him. I said, yeah, it hadn't happened since. You know, it'd been a long time. I had to humble her a little bit, right? But if you were to look at that season in Deion's life, you would think that Deion was on a winning streak. Not just in life, but in sports, right? You would look at all that they were accomplishing on the field, and then you might look at his life from a worldly perspective and be like, wow, he's got fame, he's got money, he's got success, he has beautiful women all around him. But Deion would tell you himself that in that season of his life, he was miserable because he knew that he was running from God. In fact, Deion said, "I knew that God was calling me to become a follower of Jesus, but I would not accept the call because I did not want to change." And so you know what he did? He kept running. But what he didn't realize is that he was running into a very dangerous place. In 1997, after winning back-to-back Super Bowls, Deion Sanders got into his souped-up sports car and he tried to kill himself. Deion was running from God, and because he was running from God, he was experiencing a lot of the natural and painful consequences. He was talking about how he was living through a very painful divorce. He talked about the fact that he was surrounded by people, but he felt very much alone. He felt so empty and so miserable that he literally drove his sports car off a 30 to 40-foot cliff. He should have died, but he lived. And he decided that if I'm going to live, then I need to start living for God, and I need to stop running from God. He started to be awakened to how dangerous it can be, and that is how Deion Sanders became a follower of Jesus. Now, we all run. We just all run in different ways. For some of us, we run intellectually. We choose to stop believing because the truth is, deep down inside, we don't really want to believe. And so we try to bombard our minds with all kinds of reasons and logic and arguments about how God isn't real or the Bible isn't true. We convince ourselves so that we can live however we want to live. For other people, though, they run in a very different way. For some people, they just say no to God's plan for their life so that they can go and do whatever they want to do with their life. When other people run, they hold on to a sin because for them that sin, it just seems so fun or it feels so good. One way or another, you will run at some point in your life to one degree or another. We all do. Now, as you might imagine, in my line of work, I speak with a lot of people who are running from God. Now, most of the time, I talk to them after they've been running from God for a while. They don't want to talk to me before they start running from God, but they want to talk after, because after you've been running from God for a while, you start to suffer some of those natural and painful consequences. In some ways, when I listen to their stories, it reminds me a lot of an old Geico commercial. I'm just curious, how many of you have ever seen this commercial? You guys remember this one? Okay, a lot of you remember this one. For those of you who may not remember it, it was a commercial about these four young friends who are in a horror movie, and so they're running, right? In fact, in this very scene, they stop to have a conversation about where they should run to. And you can tell in this scene that when people are running from things, they're not thinking clearly. A lot of people run, but they don't always think. And so as they're talking, one of them says, we should go hide in the attic or maybe down in the basement. The only girl in the group who was thinking clearly says, why don't we just jump in the running car? But does anybody remember where they actually ran to and where did they hide? Behind the chainsaws. That's exactly right. In fact, the entire commercial ends by saying this: if you're in a horror movie, you make poor decisions. It's what you do. Now, I want to tell you today that when you run from God, you make poor decisions. It's what you do. When Deion was running from God, he made some very poor decisions. In times in my life when I've been running from God, I have made some really poor decisions. And what you're going to see today in Jonah's story is that when Jonah runs from God, he makes a lot of poor decisions and he ends up hurting himself in a lot of big ways. In fact, when you think about Jonah's story, when you think about Deion's story, when you think about your story or someone else's story, one of the things that you will start to notice, it happens almost every single time, is that when we run from God, we run to the most dangerous places. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever run to a place in your life and it was so dangerous you scared yourself? I've been there. I have run to places and I have thought to myself, what am I doing here? I have got to get myself out of here. And I'm telling you right now, Jonah experienced the exact same thing in his life. That when he ran from God, he ran into some very dangerous places because he was making some very poor decisions. I want you to think about that as you listen to his story. Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. God said to him, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord, and he headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. Now, if you look at this story, what you see are three phrases that all confirm the exact same spiritual truth. That when Jonah was a man, he was a man who was running from God. This is so important for you to understand, because there are a lot of Bible teachers and even Bible studies, and what they do when they tell the story of Jonah is they talk so extensively about how wicked the Ninevites were that you almost get the impression that Jonah was running from the Ninevites, that he wasn't running from God. But that's not what the text says. If you look back in verse 3, at the beginning of that verse, we're told that Jonah ran away from the Lord. If you look at the end of verse 3, we're told that he sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. And then if you were to keep reading all the way down to verse 10, which we looked at last week, we're not going to get to it this week, but all the way down to verse 10, you would discover that the sailors on that boat, they knew that Jonah was running away from the Lord, because Jonah told them that's why he was on their boat. It's very clear in this story that Jonah was not running from the Ninevites. Jonah was running from God. Now, in some ways, it reminds me a lot of that old kids movie, Finding Nemo. Everybody love that movie? Pretty cool movie. A lot of old people are like, dude, I love that movie. I'm going home to watch it this afternoon, right? Nemo's dad in that movie, he always told his son two things. He said, stay close, and he said to him, never go near the drop-off. But one day, like so many of us do, Nemo goes to school, and his buddies, they talk him into doing the exact opposite of what his dad had told him to do. Instead of staying away from the drop-off, they say, come on, Nemo, we're going to go check out the drop-off. And so they get to the drop-off, and if you remember this scene, these little fish are sitting there, and they're like, wow, and they're like freaking out. And one of them goes out to the edge of the reef and goes just a little bit off of the reef and then swims back, right? They dare the next one. Come on, man, go. And so he goes, and what does he do? He goes just a little bit farther off of the reef and then swims back into the safe zone. And then it's Nemo's turn. But right then, Nemo's dad shows up, and he scolds his son and embarrasses him in front of his friends. And then his dad turns to the teacher of the school and says, maybe he's just not ready and he'll come back next year. And as they're having a conversation, you can see in Nemo a spirit of defiance that is rising up in him. And he decides that he is going to disobey his father. He gave into the peer pressure. He swam out into the open sea so that he could touch the butt. That's right. It wasn't the boat. He wanted to touch the butt, right? Nemo wanted to prove that he could do whatever he wanted to do. And so he did. But when he did, the worst thing imaginable happened. If you remember, these scuba divers come surfacing up from the bottom of the sea, and they scoop little Nemo into a net and throw him on their boat and take him all the way back, and he's thrown into an aquarium. And it looks like he's going to spend the rest of his life in that prison because of one decision that he made in one moment of his life when he gave in to that spirit of defiance that we all feel. Now, thankfully for Nemo, he had a father that was a lot like our Heavenly Father in this way. That when the son leaves the father will not stop looking until the son who is lost has finally been found. In fact, if you weren't here last week traveling on vacation for the big break and everything, you need to go back and you need to listen to last weekend's message, because in that message we said that's who God is and that's what God always does. Now, thankfully, that's who God is, but that's not who we always are, right? We have to have a spirit like Nemo in that we actually want to go back home. We realize how terrible disobedience is and what it produces, but Jonah's not there, at least not yet. At this point in the story, Jonah doesn't want to obey. He wants to run from the Father instead of obeying the Father. And so according to verse 3, Jonah goes down to this port in Joppa to board a boat and head for Tarshish. Now, if you look at this on a map, you will see that Nineveh is to the east and Tarshish is to the west. And so Jonah is going in the exact opposite direction of where God told him to go. Isn't that what so many of us do when we run from God? Well, we do the exact opposite of what God has told us to do. God says, don't watch something like that. But we watch something like that. God says, don't talk like that and say things like that, but we talk like that and we say things like that. God says, don't go to that party, don't date that kind of person, but we do it anyway. And not only that, but do not miss this. Jonah was going as far away from God as he could possibly get. He's not just going in the opposite direction. He is going as far away from God as he could possibly get. According to John Mark Comer, who is, in my opinion, one of the great Bible teachers of our day, Tarshish was literally the last dot on the map in the ancient world. And so it's like Jonah opens up this map and he asks himself the question, how far can I go to get away from this God? And he looks as far as he can go, and he's looking for Timbuktu, but he settles for Tarshish because it's the last dot on the map in the ancient world. And so let me just pause right there, and I want to ask you a really, really important question. If you are running from God, how far are you planning to go? If you're running from God, how far are you planning to go? For Jonah, he's going all the way. He's going all the way to the Tarshish, all the way to the end of the map. But let me ask you, where is your journey going to end? If you're the kind of person who's like, I'm not really into church, just came because somebody invited me, don't know what I really believe about Jesus or God, I just want to ask you to think about this. Like, where is that going to end for you? Like, what kind of person do you think you will become if you never have anything to do with God or the Bible or faith or Jesus? How do you think this corrupt world will corrupt your soul and your mind? What kind of temptations do you think you will eventually give into? What kind of sins do you think your kids are going to struggle with? If you do believe in God and you're still running from God, the question is, how's it going to end for you? Are you going to keep going until you get caught? Are you going to keep going until you lose your family or lose your job? Are you going to keep going until you run out of money or end up in rehab? Or are you trying to go as far away from God as you can possibly get? But for some of you, you're a rule follower, so you ain't even thinking like that. But what you do is a little bit different. You say, well, I'm going to do it, but just this once. You say to yourself, I'm going to do it, but man, compared to what everybody else is doing, what I'm doing is not that bad. I don't know how far you plan on going, but you need to think about it because there are a lot of people in the world who are running, but they're not thinking. They're not thinking about where this is going to end. They're not thinking about how this is going to play out. And I'm telling you right now, that is a very dangerous game to play. My mom used to tell me all the time, Brandon, sin will take you farther than you want to go. It will keep you longer than you want to stay. and it will cost you more than you want to pay. I don't know what Bible teacher my mom heard that from, but she is absolutely right. And you need to know it. You need to know this, whether it's big sin or little sin. Sin will take you farther than you want to go. It really will. That act of defiance and disobedience is going to take Jonah far away from God. It's going to take Jonah far away from his homeland, far away from his family, because that's what sin does. Sin always takes you farther than you want to go. It keeps you longer than you want to stay, and it always costs you more than you want to pay. When we run from God, we make poor decisions. It's what we do. Craig Rochelle once said, if you want to run from God, the devil will always offer you a ride. That's exactly what happened in Jonah's life. He decided he was going to run from God, and so the devil arranged the ride. Here comes this camel Uber back in the day. Pulls up, hey man, you can take me down to the port. He heads down to the port, rolls up into the port, and what do you know? There is a boat that is sitting in the harbor, and it's ready to set sail. And guess where it was going? It was going to Tarshish. The devil was going to arrange the ride because he wanted to get Jonah as far away from God as possible so that he could do as much damage to Jonah as possible. I need you to believe that when we run from God, we run to some very dangerous places. If you are frustrated in your marriage, you will run to some very dangerous places, and the devil will create the opportunity. A lot of times you'll run back to your mama or your daddy. A lot of times you will run into the arms of another man or another woman. Do not do that. Students, when you are frustrated with your parents, you will run to some incredibly dangerous places. Do not do that. When we are frustrated with God, we run to dangerous places. If you look at Jonah's story, Jonah had all kinds of options in terms of how he could have run. He could have said, God, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. He could have said, I'm not going to Nineveh. In fact, I'm not going anywhere. He could have dug his heels in and stayed right there in the region of Joppa. But he didn't do that. You know why? Because guilt always makes you want to go. Isn't that the story of Adam and Eve? Right? They disobey God in Genesis chapter 3. They hear God walking in the garden, looking for them. And what did they do? They covered themselves in shame. They ran from God and they hid from God because guilt always makes you want to go. Or how about this option? He could have said, God, I'm not going to do what you want me to do, but instead I'm going to stay put. And I'm going to kind of live in this region, right? If you were to look at Joppa on a map in the ancient world, Joppa sat on the west bank of Israel, about 35 miles from Jerusalem. Jonah was a prophet. Israel was a very spiritual place. He could have spent the rest of his life staying right there in any one of those cities in Israel that you read about in the New Testament, and he could have continued to act like a prophet. But Jonah didn't do that. You see, when Jonah ran from God, he ran to one of the most dangerous places you could ever go, the open sea. Now, as people who live on the coast, you know this. The sea can be a very dangerous place to be. You get out there in the open sea and the winds kick up and the storm blows in and you can find yourself in trouble in a hurry. In fact, let me just ask you, how many of you have ever been out on like Horn Island or Ship Island or maybe all the way out to Chandelier, and you had yourself sitting out there on the beach soaking up the rays and drinking a cold drink and just having a great day, and you didn't know that behind you the storm was blowing in? And when you realized the storm was blowing in, you had one of two choices. You could sit there, pull the umbrella down, hunker down, and stay on dry land, let the storm pass, and then make your way back home. How many of you have made that decision? Let me see your hands, okay? A lot of you have. Now, keep your hands up for just a second. These are the wisest people in the room, okay? These are the people you should ask advice for. Now, hands back down. We're going to go with all the other stupid people in the room, okay? You looked at the storm and it was blowing in and you decided, I think we can make it. And so you said, hurry kids, pack it all up. Let's put it all in the boat. You're throwing stuff in the boat. You get in the boat and you decide you're going to make a run for it. But you got caught in the storm and you regretted that decision. All the hands sheepishly go up if you've ever done it. Yes. And your wife almost killed you for it, right? You'll never do it again, man. See, the truth is, you can get out on the open sea, and it is a very dangerous place to be. Several years ago, I had a bunch of friends who invited me to go offshore fishing with them. And when we went out, the winds kicked up and the seas got really rough. And at one point, I just said to my buddy Jeff, I said, Jeff, man, like, what are the biggest waves you've ever been in? And he thought for about half a second, and he said, these waves. I was like, awesome. Thanks, Jeff. Love you, buddy. Now, I haven't been out a lot. Not as much as a lot of you, but I've been out enough to know that the sea really can be a dangerous place to be. And I would add that it is especially dangerous for a man who is running from God. And yet that's exactly where Jonah goes. Out into the open sea. At the end of verse 3, we're told that Jonah set sail. He doesn't have 300s on the back of that boat. He is at the mercy of the wind, which means he is at the mercy of God. Jonah set sail to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. In verse 4, the text says, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. Even if those guys were experienced sailors, they may not have survived because the ship may not have survived. The storm got that violent. And then it got even worse. If you look down in verses 11 to 13, we're told the sea was getting rougher and rougher. If you're using your Jonah Bible journal, underline those three words, rougher and rougher. So they asked him, Jonah, what should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us? Pick me up and throw me into the sea, he replied, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, that this great storm has come upon you. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, underline this last phrase, for the sea grew even wilder than before. If you're using your Jonah Bible journal, not only underline that last phrase, but right beside it in the margin, I want you to make this note. The further he ran, the rougher things got. Jonah's running. And the further he goes, the harder the wind blows, the more violent the storms get, the bigger the waves get. And so these sailors are looking for any way to make it stop. But the only way to make it stop was for Jonah to stop. The only way to make the storm stop is for these sailors to literally pick this man up and throw him overboard so that he has to stop running from God. You just need to know in your life, the only way to make the storm stop is for you to stop. You have to stop running from God. In fact, I just want you to think about a time in your life when you weren't doing what God wanted you to do. You see yourself in those dangerous places. What places were you at? What people were you around? What storm were you in? I'll tell you in my life, I will never forget being in high school, in a car with a group of friends, and I knew that there were drugs in the car. I was a little bit nervous and reluctant to get into the car, but I got really nervous when we're sitting at a stoplight and the police officer pulled up next to us at that light. And in that moment, I started to realize this isn't just wrong, this is dangerous. These are very different things. That this isn't just wrong, that this is dangerous. And so if you're running, I need you to stop running and start thinking. Start thinking about the fact that it is wrong and yes, it is dangerous. Would you just be honest with yourself about where this road is going to lead if you continue on it? See, sometimes you can see the danger, but I think a lot of times people are oblivious to the danger. You can't see it if you're running, but what's interesting is that everyone else around you can see the danger that's about to engulf you. Have you ever noticed this? That someone is running from God and they're just kind of talking out life and explaining or verbalizing what they're planning to do next. And then the people around them, the people who love them and care about them, that they hear them talking about their plans and they are either thinking or they are saying, wait, you're gonna do what? Hold on a minute, you're gonna move in with who? Hold on, time out, you're going where? It's like you say it and you're not even thinking about the danger, but everyone else around you can see the danger of that decision that you're about to make. It is inevitable, man. When people run from God, they run to some really dangerous places. And so the question is, why would anyone ever run from God? I'm going to tell you why. It's because we don't believe the truth. See, being a Christian is not just about believing the truth about Jesus, who he is and why he came and why he died. But being a Christian means we believe the whole truth that God has given us. Even, or maybe even especially, the truth about how dangerous it can be to run from God. And yet there are a lot of Christians who don't believe it. Or at least they don't really believe that it will ever happen to them. We think that our situation is unique. We think that we have a good reason for why we're trying to do what we want to do. We think that it's justified in some weird way. But that's why Paul wrote what he wrote in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Do not miss this. He said, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. I really do believe that Jonah was deceived. I believe that he believed in God. I believe he had a relationship with God. But I believe that he really thought in his mind, I can run and I can get away with it. I can do what I want to do. I do not have to do what God wants me to do. But let me tell you something. If you really believe that God cannot be mocked, if you really believe that a man always reaps what he sows, then you won't run. And if you are running, then you will stop. But a lot of Christians, they don't believe that, and so they just keep on running, and they run right into the danger just like Jonah did. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12 puts it like this: there is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. I want you to think about how scary that verse is. There is a way that appears to be right to a man. Like Jonah is looking at his situation and he's going, this is the right move. I am going to Tarshish. I know God told me to go here, but I am going there. And it seemed right to him. But what we see in this story is that the way that seems right to a man, it often leads to death. I want you to think about that. I want you to really listen, and I want you to be careful. I want you to understand that you don't have to go through with it. I want you to think in light of that verse that you don't have to get on that proverbial boat. You don't have to continue down this road. You don't have to continue in that sin. You really can throw away the ticket and you can turn your life around. You can make a change. You can go to counseling. You can start to believe these truths. You can come back to God. In fact, I really do believe that that's why God brought some of you here today. I believe that God wanted to show you today where this road is going to end so that he could change the direction of your life. I want you to know this. You are only one hard decision away from getting out of the storm and getting back into a very safe place. I want you to know this. You are only one hard decision away from getting right back into the center of God's will for your life. But you have to make that decision. You have to decide, I am no longer running from God. You have to believe that his grace and his mercy is sufficient for you and that there is still hope for you. You have to believe that his plans and the wisdom of his commands are going to keep you on the right track in life. You have to set aside your will and you have to surrender to his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so right here, right now, I'm asking you to stop running and to start following. I'm asking you to stop running from God and to start following Jesus Christ as the one who came into the world to forgive your sins and the one who came into the world to lead your life by teaching you and setting an example for you. Let's pray together. As we bow our heads in prayer, I imagine that some of you are here today and you came into this place and you are not a follower of Jesus. If that's you, I want to invite you at this time to just say to God, God, I am done running and I am ready to start following. I'm asking you, God, to forgive my sins. Believe that that's why Jesus came and that's why Jesus ultimately died. I'm asking you, God, to lead my life. God, I'm weak and I admit that there are times when I will want to run again. But God, I pray right now with all of my heart that you will help me to stop running and to start following Jesus. If you are new to faith and a relationship with Jesus, I want to invite you to do something right now while everyone else continues to pray and talk to God about how he's been speaking to them. But if you just started a relationship with Jesus, I'm asking you to pull out your phone right now. And I want you to text the word Jesus to the number on the side screen. It's 228-400-3007. Now, the reason I want you to text that word Jesus to that number is because I want to talk to you about being baptized. See, baptism is not only a way of showing everyone else that you've chosen to follow Jesus. It's taking a private decision and it's making it public. But what that does is it creates a healthy sense of accountability. That if people have looked at your life and said, man, there's someone who's running from God, that's you saying, no, from this point forward, I want to follow God with my life. And that is a very healthy thing. And so if that's a decision that you're making today, we have a baptism service that's coming up in just a week or two. Would love to talk to you about being baptized. So text the word Jesus to 228-400-3007. While you're doing that, the rest of us are going to pray. I want you right where you sit, if you are a follower of Jesus, to be honest with God about how you're running. It may be in a really big way. It may feel like to you it's a really small thing, but you're running and you're realizing that sin, big and small, it will take you farther than you want to go, and it will keep you longer than you want to stay, and it will cost you more than you want to pay. And so right where you sit, would you just say, God, I'm done. I don't want to run. I want to follow, but God, I need your help. I need your strength. I need your self-control. I need you to change my heart and my desires. I need you to help me see very clearly the errors of my way. God, I need your help. Help me to follow rather than run. God, we thank you so much for this passage, and I just pray that you would use it to change people's lives in a radical and definite way. Pray that when we look back on this day and we think about this service, that we would see that it really was a defining moment in our lives. God, would you produce that kind of change? I pray all these things in Jesus' powerful name. Amen.